I was standing in a twisted, jagged pile of $40,000 worth of aerospace-grade aluminum, holding a shattered fragment of the retractable commercial sunshade I had personally engineered for my 8-year-old disabled daughter. The Homeowners Association president, a deeply bitter woman who considered modern accessibility features a direct, personal threat to her 1950s neighborhood harmony, had just sent a crew of men with heavy power saws to demolish my daughter's safe space in the broad daylight while my family was at the hospital. She genuinely thought that weaponizing the vaguely written aesthetic bylaws of our Arizona subdivision gave her the absolute, unquestionable right to destroy our medical sanctuary. What she did not know, and what her expensive corporate lawyers failed to research, was that I am a senior software systems architect who builds federal compliance and regulatory codes for the United States Department of Defense for a living. I am a man who hunts for microscopic loopholes in million-line systems. By the time my attorney and I were completely finished with her, not only did she lose her petty neighborhood throne, but she was personally bankrupt, and we were walking out of a United States federal courthouse with a $200,000 judgment against the entire board of directors. My name is Elias Thorne. I am 45 years old, and for the last 2 solid decades, I have worked as a systems architect specializing in highly classified defense contracts. In my specific line of work, a single misplaced line of code or a slightly misinterpreted federal compliance regulation does not just crash a web browser. It grounds fleets of aircraft and costs the government tens of millions of dollars. Because of this, my entire brain is hardwired for extreme documentation, airtight logic, and multiple layers of redundancy. I am not a man who acts on impulsive emotion, and I certainly do not leave things to chance. 7 years ago, my wife Sarah and I made the incredibly difficult decision to uproot our quiet, predictable lives in the snowy Midwest and move across the country to Saguaro Springs Estates, a supposedly quiet, upscale, tightly managed subdivision in the northern, sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. We did not pack up our entire lives for the manicured golf courses or the scenic mountain views. We moved specifically, desperately, for our daughter, Chloe. Chloe is 8 years old now. She was born with a severe, highly rare neurological condition called dysautonomia, which completely compromises her autonomic nervous system, specifically her body's natural ability to regulate its own core temperature. If she gets too cold, her joints physically lock up in agonizing pain. If she gets too hot, her body cannot sweat to cool itself down, and she can spiral into a life-threatening, severe heat stroke within a matter of 15 minutes. Living in the Valley of the Sun gave us the stable, continuously warm baseline she desperately needed to avoid the paralyzing Midwestern winter cold, but the brutal Arizona summers presented a completely different, terrifying medical challenge. From May to September, when the afternoon ambient temperature routinely spikes to 118 degrees, baking the concrete and radiating heat long into the night, the direct Arizona sun is essentially lethal to her. She is confined to a specialized, custom-molded pediatric wheelchair. For the first few years we lived in Saguaro Springs, she spent her entire summers completely trapped indoors, forced to watch the neighborhood kids ride their bikes and play in the sprinklers outside through our dual-pane living room window. Watching her press her small hands against the warm glass, unable to join them, broke my heart every single day. I could not fix her neurology, but I am an engineer. I could absolutely fix her environment. I spent 8 solid months meticulously designing a custom, heavily modified, climate-controlled pergola for our expansive backyard. This was not something you buy out of a cardboard box at a big-box hardware store and assemble with an Allen wrench on a Sunday afternoon. I engineered a massive 32 by 20-foot structure using high-grade 6061T6 aerospace aluminum, bolted deeply into structural concrete footings that I had poured 36 inches deep into the desert soil, perfectly compliant with Maricopa County Section 405 building codes. The roof featured a tightly integrated, flush-mounted 8-kilowatt building-integrated photovoltaic solar array. It was mathematically angled to capture the maximum solar yield during the Phoenix summer solstice, designed to offset the massive air conditioning costs of running our home at a constant 70 degrees. But the most critical component, the entire reason the structure existed, was the commercial-grade, fully retractable ADA-compliant shade system. It was wired directly to a smart weather station mounted on my roof ridge, programmed to automatically deploy a heavy, UV-blocking tension fabric when the sun hit a specific angle, creating a heavily shaded, 80-degree microclimate directly over our rear patio. It was designed to allow Chloe to safely roll her wheelchair out the back doors, feel the evening breeze on her face, and actually experience the outdoors without risking a catastrophic medical emergency. I worked overtime, took on freelance coding contracts, and saved up exactly $39,500 in cash to build her this sanctuary. Before a single shovel hit the dirt, I followed the rules. I submitted a highly detailed, professionally bound 70-page engineering binder to the Saguaro Springs Architectural Review Committee. This is exactly where I formally met the architect of my family's nightmare, Regina Caldwell. Regina was 55 years old, a former, moderately successful interior designer whose career peaked in the late 1990s, and she was the tyrannical, undisputed president of our homeowners association. Regina's entire personality and daily identity were violently wrapped up in maintaining what she aggressively called the timeless, mid-century Santa Barbara aesthetic of our subdivision. She absolutely despised anything that looked remotely modern. She hated visible solar panels. She waged war on satellite dishes. And as I quickly learned sitting across from her in the community clubhouse, she harbored a deep, unspoken, visceral resentment for anything resembling a medical accommodation that ruined her pristine, uniform sightlines. During our initial Tuesday evening committee meeting, she sat behind a folding table, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked at my highly technical blueprints like I had just handed her a bag of garbage. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the structural elevations and complained loudly, making sure the other board members could hear, that the metallic finish of the aviation-grade aluminum was far too industrial for a residential neighborhood. She argued that the massive footprint of the structure was completely unnecessary for a simple patio cover. I kept my voice perfectly level. I calmly, politely explained that the heavy-duty materials were absolutely required by the county to support the extreme dead weight of the 8-kilowatt solar grid, and the wide footprint was mathematically necessary to accommodate the precise ADA turning radius of a motorized pediatric wheelchair. I explained my daughter's medical condition in clear, clinical terms. Regina did not look at me with an ounce of human empathy. She looked at me as if my disabled daughter was simply an inconvenient code violation waiting to happen. After 45 minutes of grueling, patronizing debate, she finally relented. She aggressively stamped a green conditional approval seal on the very last page of my packet, aggressively scribbling her signature across the bottom. I should have read the deep hesitation and malice in her eyes, but I was exhausted, and I was just profoundly relieved to finally get the green light to build my daughter's safe space. The heavy construction took exactly 3 weeks. The day the contractor finally packed up his trucks and swept the driveway, Sarah wheeled Chloe out the back French doors and onto the newly poured, smooth concrete patio. I pressed the remote control. The heavy canvas shade deployed flawlessly, gliding silently along the aluminum tracks, instantly blocking the vicious afternoon sun. For the very first time in her entire life, my daughter sat outside in the middle of July for 2 straight hours. She laughed, splashed her hands in a plastic water table we had set up, and just breathed the fresh outside air in the cool, protected shade. Seeing the sheer, unadulterated joy on her face, seeing my wife cry tears of absolute relief, made the $39,000 feel like the cheapest, greatest bargain I had ever struck in my life. That profound joy lasted exactly 11 days. It started on a Tuesday afternoon with a highly aggressive phone call from the HOA's property management company. Regina had driven her customized white golf cart down the public utility alley behind our block wall and unilaterally decided that the very top edge of the solar array was slightly visible from the street if you stood on your tiptoes. 2 days later, a formal, legally threatening warning letter arrived in my mailbox. It cited a severe violation of the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, specifically Section 8.4 regarding exterior alterations. The letter explicitly claimed that the structure used unapproved, non-wood materials that fundamentally degraded the historical aesthetic and property values of Saguaro Springs. I immediately scanned her own signed, green-stamped approval document and emailed it directly to the management office, assuming this was just a massive bureaucratic miscommunication. Her response came 4 days later via certified, trackable mail. Regina claimed in writing that the architectural approval was strictly contingent on the massive structure blending seamlessly with the primary residence. Because I had not somehow painted the smooth aerospace aluminum to look like textured, faux wood grain, she declared that the original approval was retroactively and permanently revoked. The very first fine was $100. I absolutely refused to pay it, drafting a highly professional, meticulously cited response noting the ADA necessity of the structure and the state laws protecting solar installations. They completely ignored my letter. The next week, the fine automatically escalated to $250. The letters flooding my mailbox grew increasingly hostile, completely, intentionally ignoring any mention whatsoever of Chloe's severe medical condition and focusing entirely, obsessively on neighborhood property values and visual harmony. Regina quickly escalated from administrative threats to a systematic, deeply unsettling campaign of physical harassment. She would park her white golf cart at the very end of my driveway for 20 minutes at a time, just sitting there behind her sunglasses, staring blankly at my house, furiously scribbling notes on a clipboard to intimidate my wife. She unilaterally deactivated my family's electronic keycard access to the community pool and clubhouse, claiming we were formally designated as members not in good standing due to outstanding, unpaid fines. The toxic stress of the situation began to heavily permeate the walls of our house. Sarah was losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, constantly terrified that Regina would somehow force us to tear down the only thing that gave our daughter a normal, happy summer. I tried to act as the peacemaker. I formally requested a mediated session with the board of directors to legally explain the federal protections regarding reasonable accommodations for recognized disabilities. Regina's retained legal counsel flatly, arrogantly denied the request in writing. They stated that community aesthetic guidelines superseded any personal, individual preferences. They did not view Chloe's life-threatening medical necessity as a federally protected civil right. They viewed it as an annoying, ugly inconvenience to their neighborhood's heavily marketed visual brand. And as the accumulating daily fines violently crossed the $3,000 mark, a final, terrifyingly worded notice arrived, aggressively taped directly to the glass of my front door. It legally declared the entire $40,000 pergola an illegal, unauthorized, and dangerous nuisance structure. The bold text at the bottom stated clearly that if I did not completely dismantle the structure within exactly 14 days, the Homeowners Association would take immediate, corrective physical action at my total expense. We had a massive, all-day medical evaluation scheduled for Chloe at the Phoenix Children's Hospital later that same week. I assumed we would deal with the lawyers when we got back. I did not fully comprehend it yet, standing there on my porch reading that letter, but Regina Caldwell was actively monitoring our family's schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Geminido NOI. The absolute nightmare did not happen in the dead of night. Criminals operate in the dark, but petty neighborhood tyrants operate in the broad daylight of bureaucracy, hiding safely behind clipboards and laminated vendor contracts. It was a Tuesday morning in late July. We had a highly anticipated, scheduled, comprehensive autonomic neurology evaluation for Chloe at Phoenix Children's Hospital. It was an all-day appointment. We loaded her specialized pediatric wheelchair into our modified mobility van at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning and pulled out of Saguaro Springs Estates. Regina Caldwell, who monitored the neighborhood comings and goings like a bored, vindictive prison warden, knew exactly when my vehicle left the subdivision. She had been intentionally, maliciously waiting for us to leave the property. At exactly 9 o'clock, while we were sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room miles away, a massive flatbed truck and a heavy demolition crew of 4 men pulled right up to my house. They did not have a judge's court order. They had a laminated work order formally signed by the Homeowners Association president, authorizing the immediate abatement of a nuisance structure. Because we lived in a strict, managed subdivision, the vendors had community gate codes and a legal presumption of authority. A few neighbors peeked out their front windows, assuming we had simply hired contractors to take the patio cover down for maintenance. Nobody called the police, because in the broad daylight, Men wearing reflective safety vests dismantling metal look like scheduled maintenance, not felony vandalism. They spent 6 solid hours systematically, brutally dismembering my disabled daughter's medical sanctuary. They used heavy diamond blade concrete saws to slice right through the structural aluminum pillars, tore the expensive, weather-treated solar canvas down into the dirt, and completely severed the 8-kilowatt solar microinverters. We drove back into our subdivision at 4 o'clock that afternoon, completely exhausted from the long medical evaluations, but profoundly relieved to be heading home. I pulled the van into the driveway, lowered the motorized ramp, and wheeled Chloe through the house toward the back French doors. She was tired and just wanted to sit under her cool, shaded canopy to eat her dinner and decompress. I pushed the back door open, and the physical sight that greeted me is permanently, violently burned into my retinas. The $40,000, highly engineered structure was entirely gone. The patio was completely barren, heavily scarred with deep, aggressive saw marks and jagged, exposed stumps of sharp metal sticking directly out of the concrete foundation. They had thrown the shattered, twisted wreckage into a massive, jagged pile near the back cinder block wall like absolute garbage. Chloe wheeled herself slowly onto the blistering hot concrete. She looked at the massive, empty expanse, then at the jagged metal, and her eyes went wide with sheer, uncomprehending panic. She looked up at me, her voice shaking, and asked where her safe place went. I stood there, completely paralyzed by the sheer financial and emotional devastation, trying to find the right words to explain human malice to an 8-year-old child. But I didn't get the chance. Dysautonomia does not wait for a convenient time to strike. The massive, immediate spike of emotional shock and profound grief sent her fragile autonomic nervous system into a terrifying, uncontrollable tailspin. Within exactly 15 minutes, her core body temperature began to spike uncontrollably in the Arizona afternoon heat. Her face turned a dangerous, mottled red. Her small hands locked up in agonizing, rigid cramps, and she began hyperventilating, entirely unable to physically regulate her own physical state. We had just spent 8 hours at the hospital, and now we were rushing right back. I scooped my daughter out of her wheelchair, my wife grabbed the medical emergency bag we kept by the door, and I drove my truck at 90 miles an hour down the interstate back to the emergency room. We spent the next 14 agonizing hours sitting in a sterile pediatric intensive care room, watching intravenous fluids slowly stabilize our daughter's violently fluctuating core temperature. Sitting in that uncomfortable vinyl hospital chair, listening to the rhythmic, electronic beeping of the heart monitor, watching my wife quietly cry over our daughter's bruised hand, the paralyzing grief inside my chest slowly, permanently mutated. It crystallized into a cold, terrifyingly focused, absolute rage. I stopped being a grieving, helpless father in that exact moment. I completely reverted to being a senior defense software systems architect. Regina Caldwell wasn't just a petty neighbor anymore. She was a hostile, destructive virus that had violently attacked my network, and I was going to systematically, ruthlessly tear her entire operating system apart line by line until there was absolutely nothing left. I left the hospital the next morning when Chloe was finally stabilized, drove straight home, locked myself inside my home office, and went to war. I didn't bother calling the local police department. I knew exactly how that interaction would go. Without physical threats or an active restraining order, the local county deputies would simply look at Regina's laminated homeowners association work order, declare it a neighborhood civil dispute, and tell me to take it up in small claims court. That was exactly the low-level bureaucratic mud Regina desperately wanted to wrestle in. She wanted to bleed me dry with corporate attorneys in county court over a simple property damage claim, dragging the process out for years. To completely destroy her, I needed to elevate the battlefield to a jurisdiction that absolutely terrified her. I needed to make this a federal case. I opened my laptop and pulled up the full, unedited text of the United States Federal Fair Housing Act, specifically Title 42, United States Code, Section 3604. I spent 12 straight hours reading hundreds of pages of federal case law and established judicial precedents regarding architectural modifications. The federal law is absolutely, brutally clear. It is illegal to refuse to permit, at the expense of the person with a disability, reasonable modifications of existing premises if such modifications may be necessary to afford such person full enjoyment of the premises. Furthermore, the Americans with Disabilities Act strictly protects life-saving medical accommodations. Regina didn't just secretly authorize the destruction of a $40,000 patio cover. By knowingly and maliciously ordering a demolition crew to violently destroy a federally protected, medically necessary structure that kept a disabled child out of the intensive care unit, she had actively, intentionally committed a massive, undeniable federal civil rights violation. But I needed concrete, undeniable legal proof that she acted completely outside her granted authority, not just that she made a bad administrative decision. I drove down to the Maricopa County Recorder's office in downtown Phoenix. I did not ask the property management company for a copy of the rules. I pulled the original, legally recorded 1995 covenants, conditions, and restrictions directly from the county government archives. I brought the certified, stamped copies back to my office and laid them directly next to the glossy, spiral-bound 2015 resident handbook that Regina aggressively enforced. I cross-referenced every single line of text like I was debugging a million lines of broken software code. It took me 3 days of relentless reading, but I finally found the catastrophic fatal error in her system. The glossy handbook contained a highly specific clause, Section 8.4.2, which strictly prohibited any non-wood overhead structures. Regina had used this exact fabricated clause to formally justify the demolition. But when I checked the legally recorded 1995 county documents, that specific clause simply did not exist. I pulled the state voting records. In Arizona, permanently amending a recorded homeowners association covenant requires a formal supermajority vote of exactly 67% of all homeowners. Regina had never held that vote. 7 years ago, she had simply unilaterally typed that restrictive clause into a Microsoft Word document, printed the new handbooks, and began aggressively enforcing a completely illegal, entirely fabricated rule to control the neighborhood. I still needed one final piece of leverage to prove her malicious intent, and I wasn't going to wait for a miracle to deliver it. I knew exactly where the weak link in the Homeowners Association board was. Brenda was a 60-year-old retired schoolteacher who served as the community secretary. Regina had aggressively bullied and intimidated her for 5 straight years. I knew Brenda took meticulous notes, and I knew she looked terrified during every single board meeting. I didn't ask her politely for help. I played absolute hardball. I drafted a severe, unforgiving document and paid a private process server $50 to hand it to Brenda right at her front door. The letter was a drafted and signed federal lawsuit naming her personally as a co-conspirator in a federal civil rights violation, along with a legally binding offer of total, unconditional immunity if she provided the unredacted executive board meeting minutes from the week of the demolition. It was a terrifying, aggressive legal threat designed to make her choose between her loyalty to Regina and her own retirement savings, and it worked exactly as mathematically calculated. That same night at exactly 9 o'clock, my cell phone rang. It was Brenda, crying hysterically, begging me not to take her house. I told her to meet me in the empty Target parking lot on Camelback Road in 20 minutes and bring the documents. I sat in my truck under a flickering halogen streetlight until her dark sedan pulled up next to me. She didn't say a word. She just reached her trembling hand out the window, handed me a thick brown envelope, and immediately sped out of the parking lot. I turned on the dome light and opened the envelope. Inside were the raw, secret meeting minutes from a closed-door session that occurred exactly 48 hours before the demolition. The minutes detailed a stark, desperate warning from the Homeowners Association's own corporate attorney. The attorney had explicitly advised Regina in writing that destroying an ADA-compliant medical structure carried massive, catastrophic federal liability and strongly recommended taking the matter to a local civil judge first. The notes explicitly detailed Regina slamming her fist on the table, legally dismissing the attorney's warning, and stating for the permanent record that she did not care about my daughter's ridiculous medical excuses and that she was going to tear down that ugly metal eyesore too. Teach me a lesson about defying her authority. It was the ultimate, undisputed smoking gun. I had everything I needed to burn her entire world to the ground. Geminido NOI. I immediately scheduled an emergency, high-priority consultation with Caleb Stone. Caleb was not a cheap, local real estate lawyer who handled minor property line disputes or drafted simple wills. He was a vicious, highly respected, aggressively successful federal civil rights litigator based in a towering glass building in downtown Phoenix. A man who made a very lucrative, intimidating living suing massive corporations and state agencies for catastrophic compliance failures. I walked into his high-rise office wearing a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a massive, professionally indexed, 300-page engineering binder. I did not ask him if I had a viable case. I sat down at his polished glass conference table and systematically laid out the exact, undeniable timeline. I provided the original county deed restrictions, the terrifying medical documentation from the pediatric intensive care unit, the high-resolution photographs of the daytime demolition, and finally, the secret board meeting minutes. Caleb sat there in complete, heavy silence for 20 straight minutes, slowly flipping through the meticulously organized tabs of my binder. When he finally looked up, his eyes were incredibly sharp, completely devoid of the usual skeptical lawyerly detachment. He closed the heavy binder, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, and told me that in his 25 years of practicing federal law, he had never seen a homeowner lay out a trap this perfectly constructed. He looked me dead in the eye and said we were not just going to sue them. We were going to absolutely annihilate them. Exactly 14 days later, Caleb formally filed a massive, 150-page civil complaint in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona, located in the Sandra Day O'Connor Federal Courthouse in downtown Phoenix. We completely bypassed the local county civil courts, the property management company, and the standard neighborhood warning letters. We went straight for the absolute legal jugular. The federal lawsuit named the Saguaro Springs Homeowners Association, the corporate property management firm, and Regina Caldwell personally, suing her both in her official capacity as board president and as an individual acting with malicious, premeditated intent. The specific counts included severe, documented violations of the Federal Fair Housing Act, direct violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, intentional infliction of severe emotional and medical distress upon a minor child, and the felony destruction of $40,000 worth of private property. I did not send the documents through the standard mail. I paid a private federal process server $300 to walk directly into an upscale, brightly lit country club in Scottsdale on a Tuesday afternoon and hand the thick, heavily bound legal summons directly to Regina while she was eating a Cobb salad with 3 of her wealthy friends. The immediate, entirely predictable reaction from the Homeowners Association was a frantic attempt to hide behind their massive corporate shield. Regina immediately contacted the board's legal counsel, arrogantly assuming their $2 million commercial umbrella insurance policy would simply hire an army of defense lawyers to crush me into submission. But here is the beautiful, brutal, unforgiving reality of corporate liability insurance that petty neighborhood tyrants never seem to understand. Insurance policies are specifically, mathematically underwritten to cover accidental negligence, slip-and-fall injuries, and minor administrative errors. They never, under any circumstances, cover intentional, malicious, premeditated criminal acts. Once the corporate insurance underwriters in Chicago received a copy of our federal complaint, specifically reading the secret meeting minutes where Regina actively, intentionally ignored her own legal advice to commit a federal violation, they sent Regina and the board a formal, legally binding letter of total denial of coverage. The insurance company stated unequivocally that because Regina had intentionally ordered the destruction of a medical structure without a valid court order, purely out of malice, she had actively voided the community's policy. She was entirely, personally on the hook for her own federal legal defense, and she was suddenly staring down the terrifying barrel of total personal bankruptcy. The federal discovery phase was an absolute, unmitigated slaughter. Unlike a local homeowners association board meeting where Regina could simply bang a wooden gavel and shut off my microphone, federal court requires sworn, mandatory depositions under the absolute penalty of perjury. 3 months into the lawsuit, we forced Regina to sit in a sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room on Central Avenue in downtown Phoenix for 7 grueling, agonizing hours. She sat across a long glass table from Caleb Stone, looking absolutely exhausted. Her pristine, confident, authoritative posture was completely gone. Her hands shook constantly as she held her reading glasses. For the first 3 hours, Caleb meticulously walked her through the architectural guidelines. She arrogantly, confidently testified under oath that Section 8.4.2 of the community bylaws gave her the absolute right to unilaterally deny any non-wood structure to protect property values. She stated on the recorded video that I had blatantly ignored the established rules of the community. That was exactly the moment Caleb Stone systematically dismantled her entire reality. He did not yell. He did not pound his fist on the table. He simply opened his leather briefcase and slid the legally recorded, certified 1995 Maricopa County deed restrictions across the glass, placing them right next to the glossy, spiral-bound 2015 resident handbook she had personally printed. He asked her to read the original county document and find Section 8.4.2. The room went dead silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the rapid scratching of the court reporter's stenography machine. Regina flipped frantically through the yellowing pages, her face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. Caleb calmly, surgically forced her to admit on the official federal record that she had completely fabricated the restrictive aesthetic clause 7 years ago without ever holding the legally required 67% supermajority vote of the homeowners. He legally proved she had ordered a daytime demolition crew based on a fake law she had invented in a Microsoft Word document to satisfy her own obsessive need for control. But the final, absolutely fatal kill shot came 20 minutes later. Regina's highly paid defense attorney desperately tried to pivot, arguing that even if the rule was improperly ratified, Regina had acted in good faith to protect the community, genuinely believing she was doing the right thing for the neighborhood's visual harmony. Caleb Stone did not say a single word. He just reached into his file and pulled out the unredacted, secret board meeting minutes that Brenda had handed me in the dark parking lot. He slid the papers across the table and asked Regina to read the third paragraph out loud. Regina stared at the paper, her eyes wide with sheer, absolute terror, and she physically could not speak. Caleb read it for her. He read the exact quote where the board's own attorney warned her about the massive federal liability of destroying a disabled child's medical structure. He read her exact recorded response, where she explicitly stated she did not care about my daughter's ridiculous medical excuses and wanted to teach me a lesson. Regina's own expensive defense attorney stopped writing on his legal pad. He slowly put his pen down, looked at the document, and then turned to stare at his client with absolute, undisguised disgust. She had intentionally lied to him, too. She had hidden the true, malicious nature of the demolition from her own legal representation. The deposition was immediately halted. Her lawyer requested a private recess, and we could clearly hear him screaming at her through the thick walls of the adjacent office, telling her that he could not protect her from federal perjury charges. We never went to a full jury trial. 2 weeks later, we sat in a heavily wood-paneled settlement conference room in front of a United States magistrate judge. The judge, a stern man with zero patience for neighborhood drama, had read the deposition transcripts and looked at Regina like she was something he had scraped off the bottom of his shoe. He bluntly informed her defense counsel that if this case went to a federal jury, they would easily award millions in punitive damages for the intentional, cruel infliction of medical distress upon a disabled child. Caleb Stone laid out our completely non-negotiable settlement terms. We demanded a $200,000 judgment. The breakdown was precise and unforgiving. $40,000 to completely replace the destroyed aerospace aluminum structure and the solar array. $100,000 for the severe medical distress, the hospital bills, and the emotional trauma inflicted upon an 8-year-old child. And $60,000 to cover every single cent of our federal attorney fees. Because the corporate insurance company had legally abandoned her, the $200,000 judgment attached directly to Regina Caldwell's personal finances. She had absolutely no way to pay it in cash. Within 45 days, a massive real estate sign went up in her impeccably manicured front yard. She was forced to completely liquidate her retirement accounts and sell her pristine, mid-century home just to satisfy the federal court order and pay her own furious defense attorneys. The settlement also included a legally binding federal injunction. Regina was forced to immediately, permanently resign from the Homeowners Association Board, and the Saguaro Springs bylaws were legally stripped and rewritten under federal oversight to include strict, undeniable protections for any and all medical and compliance structures. The afternoon the moving trucks finally arrived to pack up Regina's house, several neighbors actually came out onto their front porches and quietly watched her leave. Nobody waved goodbye. Nobody offered to help her pack. The neighborhood had finally woken up from the toxic, suffocating spell she had cast over them for the better part of a decade. We did not just rebuild the original pergola. Using the settlement funds, I hired a professional commercial architecture firm to design something even better. I poured deeper, stronger concrete footings. We built a massive 50 by 30 foot structure using reinforced industrial steel, integrated a 10 kilowatt solar roof, and installed a dual-zone outdoor climate control system with high-pressure misting lines and specialized cooling fans. It is completely, undeniably visible from the street, and it is absolutely beautiful. The day the construction was finally finished, the temperature in Phoenix hit 114 degrees. Sarah wheeled Chloe out the back doors. I pressed the remote. The heavy sunshades deployed seamlessly, and the ambient temperature on the patio immediately dropped to a cool, comfortable 82 degrees. Seeing my daughter close her eyes and just breathe the fresh outside air, completely safe and protected in her own backyard, washed away all the bitter, toxic stress of the past year. As a software systems architect, I spend my life understanding how complex systems function. A system is only as good and only as safe as the foundational code it is built upon. When a corrupt, malicious virus enters an operating system and begins aggressively destroying the vital components that keep it running, you do not try to negotiate with the virus. You do not ask it politely to stop, and you do not try to find a reasonable compromise. You isolate it, you expose its flawed logic, and you systematically, ruthlessly delete it from the server so it can never harm the network again. We live in a country built fundamentally on the sacred concept of private property rights and the absolute, uncompromising protection of our most vulnerable citizens. Yet every single day, thousands of Americans willingly surrender those profound federal rights to petty, localized neighborhood dictators who wield clipboards and fabricated rulebooks like weapons. Fighting back against Regina Caldwell cost my family a terrifying amount of emotional energy. It forced me to look at the dark, cruel reality of human nature, and it required me to become a relentless, calculating machine to protect my child. But it also taught me that the massive, complex machinery of American federal justice still works perfectly, provided you have the extreme patience and the meticulous documentation to properly pull the levers. As I stand on my patio tonight, listening to the quiet, steady hum of the solar microinverters under the vast Arizona sky, I look at the incredible sanctuary we fought so desperately to build. It makes me wonder about the quiet, invisible battles happening in subdivisions all across this country. How much of your family's safety, your peace of mind, and your fundamental American freedom are you truly willing to sacrifice just to keep the peace with an unreasonable neighbor? And if a petty tyrant ever came in the broad daylight to destroy your sanctuary, would you know exactly which laws to use to burn their entire empire to the ground?